So as many of you may know, if you're diehard fans like me, Bridgerton season 3 is coming out May 16th, and I could not be more hyped. So I figured that this was the perfect time to go read the last 3 books in the series, because if you've been around for a while, 2 years ago, I did a whole video where I read the first 5 books of the Bridgerton series. If you go to that video, you'll see my review for each book, my full thoughts, and also my ranking of each of them in regards to each other. So for those of you who are totally unfamiliar with the Bridgerton series as books, let me give you a little bit of a refresher. So each book of the Bridgerton series follows a different sibling, and as we've seen in the show, each season also follows a different sibling in the family of the Bridgertons, and we get their individual love story. Now, of course, the show expands things a lot further than the books do. The books mainly focus on the main couple for the book and have very few parts to do with the other characters, whereas in the show we obviously get a lot more from the other characters, we get competing storylines, and it's overall a more rich story. So in the previous video of this series, I read the first 5 books of the Bridgerton series. I read The Duke and I, which is Daphne's story and which is the basis for the first season. And then I read The Viscount Who Loved Me, which is Antony's story and which was the basis for season 2. Now, if you're a fan of the books, you may remember that the 3rd book of the series is An Offer from a Gentleman, and this is actually Benedict's story. But as we all know, the 3rd season of the show is actually going to be following the story of Colin and Penelope, which happens to be the basis of the 5th book in the series, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. So obviously the show is taking things a little bit out of order, but for those of you who remember the plot of An Offer for a Gentleman, it actually starts with a little prologue where the main couple meet, and then it actually jumps forward 3 years. Romancing Mr. Bridgerton also jumps forward several years, and so most of the second half of the series is taking place much later. Now, the 4th book in the series is To Sir Philip with Love, and this is Eloise's story. So out of these 5 books that I read in the last video, personally for me, Benedict's story, An Offer from a Gentleman, was my favorite one. I think it was the most compelling, it had the most fun and interesting story in terms of the plot, and had some really great chemistry between the characters. However, many of you commented on that video and let me know that there were a lot of consent issues in this book that kind of went over my head. This was 2 years ago me, so don't blame her too much. And it was also before I had read a lot more better romances. Although Julia Quinn's books are a lot of fun and I love the Regency romance element, I now do think that there are a lot of other romance books that are much better. And then in terms of my ranking for the other books, I liked The Viscount Who Loved Me next, even though I feel like I liked the book a little bit more than season 2 of the show, just because season 2 of the show got a little bit repetitive, and also for the way that Kate and Edwina's relationship was just so much more strained in the show versus in the book. I really liked them in the book. And then my next favorite would probably be The Duke and I, even though this also has a lot of problematic stuff to it and has issues with consent. This one was still a fun romance in the sense that I really liked the chemistry between the characters, and that's what really made the story for me. Whereas these 2 books were probably my least favorite of the series of the 5 that I had read so far, and that was mainly because I just didn't like the romances all that much. I didn't really like the love interests in either of these books, and I personally just really liked Penelope and Eloise's characters from the show a lot better than the books. So going into season 3, knowing the story of Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, I'm not super excited, but I am curious to see how the showrunners are going to change things and adapt the story in a bit of a different way, because they always have some fun surprises up their sleeves. Because one element of this book is that a lot of the beginning of it is spent trying to figure out who Lady Whistledown is, whereas in the show we obviously know this from season 1, and given everything that happened with Penelope and Eloise in season 2, I think that season 3 is going to be a lot more spicy than this book ever was, so I still am holding out some hope. With all that said about the books, I do really love the show, and that's why I'm going to be reading the last 3 books of the series to get ready for season 3, and also get me a little bit more hyped about the last 3 siblings in the Bridgerton family. So in my last video, I just gave you a general review of each book after I'd finished reading it. I'm also going to try to come up with as many theories as I can for how season 3 is going to go and what we're going to get in season 4 potentially, because I'm so curious to see how the show writers are going to spin the story around. So first up, I'll be reading When He Was Wicked, and this is actually Francesca's story. As we know from the show, the actress who played Francesca in the first season actually got recast at some point, so we will be seeing the new actress in season 3, and we do know from some of the trailers for season 3 that Francesca's story is going to be a bigger part of this season, and we're going to get to see a lot more of her character than we saw in, say, season 2. Now, after that book, I'll be picking up It's in His Kiss, and this is Hyacinth's story. I do think that they're going to age up Gregory and Hyacinth for the new season and for subsequent seasons, so I feel like we're going to get a lot more of their 2 characters in the next 2 to 3 seasons, and I'm really curious to see how many jumps in time they'll actually do. I do feel like there will be another jump for Benedict's or Eloise's or Francesca's story, because all of those also involve a time jump in the books. Now, after that book, I'll be picking up On the Way to the Wedding, which is Gregory's story. Gregory, as we know, is the youngest son in the family, and so far in the show, he's been very, very tiny. I do think that they're going to age up Hyacinth and Gregory in the show. However, I still don't expect too much with Gregory's character in season 3, just because we still have to go through Eloise's story, we still have to go through Benedict's story, we still have to go through Francesca's story. So there's still plenty of time to age him up, and I'm excited to see how that plays out. Gregory also has a bit more of a presence in Eloise's book, so I'm curious to see if that's going to factor into her season of the show as well. Given that Penelope and Colin's story is taking place a few years later, I'm curious to see if they're going to inject that prologue-y scene with Benedict and Sophie from his book into season 3, so that when we get to season 4, we can jump forward a few years and he'll be actively falling in love with Sophie. For those of you who haven't read the book and don't plan on reading the book, and if you haven't watched my previous video, basically in Benedict's book, the first scene is like him seeing Sophie at this ball, and he basically sort of falls for her in that meeting, but he doesn't know who she is, and then they meet many years later when she is in a much worse position because of multiple things. My hope is that we do actually go into Benedict's story for season 4 rather than Eloise's story, just because I feel like there is some development that needs to happen for Eloise's story before we can actually get there. But it may be the case that rather than building up Benedict's story for this next season, they might spend that time building up Eloise's story. Eloise's story involves her writing letters to Sir Philip, who happens to be the husband of a certain character we know from season 1. If you don't want to get spoiled, please leave now, but that is Marina, who we know from the books actually passes away. And in Eloise's story, Sir Philip starts to court her in order to get her to be his wife and take care of the children that he had with Marina. So given that we need all of this development and we also need to see Marina's character pass away, I think that Eloise's story is going to be season 5. But there's also a chance that they might slot it straight into season 4, because as we know from season 2, Colin actually reaches a moment of peace with Marina and his relationship with her. And so I think there may be a possibility that in season 3, while he's been away, while he's been traveling, or when he returns home, that we may find out that Marina has passed away, which would essentially be a really great lead up into Eloise starting to write these letters to Sir Philip, and then Penelope and Colin finally falling in love properly now that Marina is not part of the picture. I'm really curious to see which way it's going to roll, and I'm sure I'll get surprised along the way, but let me know your theories in terms of the plot lines and which story is going to come first, because there's just so many different ways it could go, and I'm so excited to see what the show writers come up with. With that said, another thing that might give us a little bit more of a clue is the beginning of Francesca's book, which I have read the first few chapters of this, and this is going really great. But essentially in the beginning of this book, we go through a lot of time and a lot of plot points. We're meeting the love interest Michael, who has been in love with Francesca as soon as he met her, but he happened to be meeting her when she was getting betrothed to his cousin James. And so now Francesca and James are married and they've been having this wonderful life, and Michael has been struggling to be around them when he's so deeply in love with Francesca, but also really loves his cousin James. However, shortly thereafter, James passes away and the title reverts to Michael. But in the book, Francesca actually happens to be pregnant, and so they think the title might stay with the kid if it's a boy, but then she ends up miscarrying, and so the title reverts to Michael. From there, the book actually takes a 4-year gap, which I found really interesting, and comes back to the story when Michael has returned from his gallivanting in India. He's been trying to stay away from Francesca because he loves her so much and he doesn't want to betray the memory of James. And Francesca has been a widow for several years, and she's been taking care of the estate of her late husband because Michael kind of left it to her to deal with, to give her something to do while he was in India. And so now they're meeting again, obviously, and Francesca is going through this moment where she's realizing she wants to have kids, but that would require her getting married again and going through the whole ordeal again, which she's not sure she's ready for, but she does go to London in hopes of entering into the season again. Now, with the time jump in Francesca's story in mind, I'm so curious to see how the story in the show is going to go, because I believe in the books, Francesca actually gets married before Eloise, and we know from the season 3 trailers that Francesca is going out into society. So I'm wondering if maybe in season 3 we're going to get these initial chapters of Francesca's book where she gets married to James and has this whole marriage and has this friendship with Michael, and then sees James die maybe at the end of the season. So when we go to the next book, we're jumping forward further in time. time. Another element to this is whether they're going to put Eloise's story before Francesca's or after Francesca's, because of the way Francesca's story has these two parts to it. So yeah, overall, I'm just really freaking curious because there's so many parts of the stories that could overlap, and I feel like this season is definitely going to be a bit of a turning point to see where the rest of the series is going to go. With that said, I'm going to finish reading Francesca's story and I will get back to you when I have more thoughts. This book. I have a lot of thoughts. I feel like I went into this book with pretty high expectations because a lot of you commented on my previous Bridgerton video saying that this one was your favorite and that you really liked the romance in this one and that you thought I would really like this one. And I have to say, in terms of an overall feeling with this one, I think it has to sit in a generally mid location. I do feel like I still enjoy this one more than Eloise's book, but I feel like it's on par with Penelope's book, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the love interest in this book, Michael, although he seemed very charming at the beginning, I started to really get annoyed by his behavior in the second half of the book, and that sort of just turned me off the whole romance and the whole book in general. I also wasn't loving the way Francesca was acting either, so that also bugged me a bit. Now, when the characters are meeting again later on, Michael has returned from India. It's like 4 years later. Francesca has sufficiently mourned James, and now she is ready to move on. She's decided that she's going to enter the London season and try to find a husband because her new objective is to have a child. She really wants a child to fill her life, and she doesn't really care if she finds love with this new husband. She just wants a kid. And then of course Michael is also getting older and he is hoping to find a bride as well during this season. And so there's a lot of tension between the two characters as this goes along. And then the one thing that I found really interesting, and which I realized I kind of knew from the two previous books, but I forgot, was that even after this 4-year jump, Penelope and Eloise are still not married yet. So Francesca's story is actually happening sort of in tandem with Colin and Penelope's, based off of a lot of the context clues that we get in here. So Colin does appear in this book quite significantly, and he plays a pretty pivotal role in the book because he's the one who suggests to Michael that perhaps he should just marry Francesca. They're both looking for a spouse. He's the Earl of Kilmartin and she's technically still Countess of Kilmartin, so it just seems more natural for them to get married. Colin makes absolute sense when he suggests this, and he's also suggesting that Michael may be in love. And the book does reveal that Colin and Michael are pretty good friends, especially because of the connection of Francesca in the family. And yeah, I found that element really interesting because there's a later scene also where Colin again reiterates this idea that Michael should marry Francesca. And then Michael happens to ask this question. He says, "And how many times have you proposed marriage?" And Colin smiles slowly and says, "Just once, actually, this afternoon, as a matter of fact." And then the scene progresses from there and Colin reveals that he has proposed to Penelope. I'm kind of fuzzy on what actually happened in Romancing Bridgerton and how that proposal went, but he does mention that there was like a lot of convincing involved, which I do kind of remember from that book. So it's just interesting to see how this book sort of ties in tandem with Penelope's story. And I do remember mentions of Francesca's story throughout the past two books, but none of it really stuck in my head, and 2 years later I'm like, I don't even remember this. But I think up until that point I was quite enjoying the book. It was fun, it was cute, but it was after that that I started to kind of not like things. So in the second half of the book, Michael goes to join Francesca in Scotland, and he wants to go tell her the news that Colin and Penelope are going to get married. Prior to this, in chapter 17, they have a really steamy, sexy scene, which I think is one of the more steamier scenes in the whole series. So I really liked it. It was a nice build-up of the sexual chemistry between the two characters, and essentially Michael makes this decision that he is going to seduce Francesca to convince her that they should get married and sort of compromise her in a way so that they can get married. And that was just something that I wasn't really vibing with because, yeah, he basically suggests to Francesca that they should get married. It makes sense following this conversation with Colin and finding out that Colin is getting married as well. And Francesca is immediately like, no, it doesn't make sense, and gets really panicky. And then he decides he's going to seduce her and comes on to her. But obviously he's not like forcing himself on her, and she does respond, but it didn't feel all that enthusiastic, I guess, and that slightly bothered me. And then when we get into the later scenes when they're in Scotland and they're sort of trapped on this Kilmartin estate, they end up getting caught in the rain, and there's this whole scene where she essentially is like rejecting him repeatedly, and he keeps saying, well, he's already compromised her and he's not going to stop until he puts a baby in her so that she's forced to marry him. And that whole reasoning and just like the way that he was so aggressively going at her was not really it for me. I just didn't like it. But that scene does follow with another steamy scene where Francesca takes more of an active role and she's trying to make the demands of him, which was really nice. But then again, after that scene, there's just more of Michael basically trying to force her to get married to him and to say yes. And she repeatedly says no or seems unsure and then eventually gives in. I didn't really like how Michael was being so forceful without really giving any sort of romantic declaration to her. And I didn't really like the way that Francesca was mostly avoiding the situation. She was fine with doing the sexual stuff, but then she would regret it later and start to feel bad about it. But then she also wouldn't really be thinking about Michael and whether she likes him. She's just so adamant in her mind that they shouldn't be together and that they shouldn't get married. And I feel like there could have been some sort of grief element in that where she's still mourning John or she still feels like she's betraying him, but that doesn't really factor in. She just seemed to me at least to be really wishy-washy for the most part. And then after multiple scenes of these two going back and forth and trying to convince each other, she ends up saying yes and then coming to him and saying that she's saying yes to getting married, but then she doesn't really give him a reason and he just kind of takes it. I don't know, it just didn't feel very romantic. There is a really nice scene towards the end of the book though where Francesca goes to visit John's grave and essentially saying to him that she thinks he would understand her position and would understand that she's fallen in love with Michael, and then, you know, they profess their love to each other again. It's a nice scene, but I do feel like that wasn't enough for me. I just needed some actual romance to be happening. Like there was just a lot of seduction, but not a lot of romance. And although Michael does make a declaration of love prior to that, it didn't feel all that romantic. It just felt like he was forced to say it. And although he had been pining for a while, after all the sex scenes, I feel like he just thinks he's entitled to her, which didn't really work for me. And then at the very end, the cherry on top for this whole situation is that they get a letter from the mother of the Bridgertons, and she essentially says that Colin and Penelope moved up their wedding and they're already married, and Eloise is also getting married, and they're like, was she even dating someone or courting someone? And so they get really confused. And then essentially Michael uses this situation, the fact that her two other siblings have gotten married or are getting married, and the fact that they did it without telling her, and the fact that she was like left out of this whole situation, he uses that to convince her to get married immediately, like that day. And her initial reaction for everything throughout this book is no. But then she always goes wishy-washy and then ends up saying yes. And he just sort of coerces her into saying yes, which I just didn't really understand. It was so aggressive for no reason. This man had zero patience. And another thing I felt with Michael was that he didn't really have much of a character growth. I feel like a lot of the other male characters in the earlier books had more character development, but Michael didn't really have that for me. And neither did Francesca for the most part, in my opinion. I didn't feel like either of them was learning a big lesson or understanding more about themselves. They just sort of fall into the situation and then start forcing it, and I just didn't really like it. So yeah, overall, I feel like this one just didn't really do it for me the way that I wanted it to. I was expecting a lot more, and I just wanted more out of the characters. While I did like their friendship and chemistry at the beginning, I just didn't feel like it paid off by the end, and everything just felt so forced. And I think I overall just wanted more agency from Francesca herself. I feel like she was just very passive and was just letting a lot of things happen to her. Not that I think that she didn't like Michael and that she wasn't like actually an active consenting partner in these sexual situations either. I just felt like emotionally she wasn't very active in this story. She, for the most part, just tries to avoid all of her emotions and all of her feelings about Michael and doesn't really have a true moment of revelation where she realizes that she really loves him. For the most part, she just keeps considering him in that light of being a friend or being a cousin. And the only thing that really makes it different is the sexual tension, but then, I don't know, I just didn't feel like the love was there. With that said, I feel like I would rate this one probably a 3-star, maybe 3.5. I feel like it's on par with Romancing Mr. Bridgerton and The Duke and I. I feel like The Duke and I even enjoyed more because there was more character development in that one, but it was nonetheless entertaining, which is what we're here for. As for my theories for season 3 based off of this book, I feel like we're gonna get a really nice introduction to Francesca's story in season 3. I think there's a potential for the showrunners to even include her getting courted and then getting married to James by the end of the season, but I don't think they're gonna follow the timeline of the books in the way that Colin, Penelope, and Eloise all get married right before Francesca gets remarried to Michael. Obviously season 3 is Penelope and Colin's story, so they have to have some sort of resolution by the end of that season, and we can pretty safely assume that they're gonna get married by the end of the season. So I think what I'm really curious about is how much time they're gonna jump between season 3 and season 4, because we know from the trailers for season 3 that it's only gone forward another season, because we've seen that little snippet where Penelope says that she's been on the market for 3 seasons and hasn't found a husband, so obviously we haven't gone further in time. So I'm curious to see how further we'll go for season 4. And then another theory that I have been sort of swirling in my mind is maybe maybe, just maybe, they do a time jump mid-season between part 1 and part 2. On social media, I know a lot of people were like going insane over the fact that the series is only 8 episodes and it's getting split into 2 parts for season 3. So I feel like there's a good chance that they might jump forward in time for part 2 of the series and sort of pull Colin and Penelope's story over those 2 parts, and then also bring in more of Francesca's story into the second half of the season. But again, who knows? There's also the element of Eloise's story and the way that her story is sort of diverging from the books in a significant way. There's a lot of stuff that's happened with her character that doesn't happen in the books. I'm just overall excited to see all of the changes that they make, because although I like the books, I think the show is definitely better in my opinion. With that said, I'm done book number 6. I'll get back to you when I finish book number 7. Okay, so I finished the 7th book in the Bridgerton series. It's In His Kiss. This is Hyacinth's story. I originally thought that this was the last book in the series because Hyacinth is the youngest sibling, but it turns out that Gregory actually gets married after her, so that's why his story is last. But this book essentially starts with a prologue that starts 10 years prior to the actual timeline of the book, and it's when our love interest Gareth is 18 years old and his father has declared to him that he's going to be marrying this girl named Mary, and then there's this talk of the fact that Mary is sort of simple-minded, which it was just absurd. And it just felt really problematic the way it was described. But anyways, Gareth is obviously totally stunned and he's really upset and he's like, no, I can't marry her. And that's when his father, the Baron of something, reveals to him that Gareth is actually his illegitimate son. And so his father, being the cruel man he is basically saying that, you know, he needs to marry Mary because that's the only way he'll secure some sort of fortune. And Gareth happens to have an older brother who is an actual legitimate child. So he's the heir to his father's fortune. Now, by the end of that scene, it seems like Gareth is not going to listen to his father, and then the book flips forward 10 years. And this is where we learn that Gareth is Lady Danbury's grandson on his mother's side. And then somewhere in the 10-year gap, Gareth's older brother actually dies. And so Gareth becomes the new heir to his father's fortune, but his father, knowing that he's illegitimate, is like totally angry about this. And so he starts spending away all of his money and starts creating all of these debts that will essentially go to Gareth once he inherits. We also learn that Lady Danbury essentially took in Gareth after his estrangement from his father when he was 18, and she paid for his education and allowed him to become the person that he is, and he's really fond of Lady Danbury as his grandmother. And lo and behold, Hyacinth has gotten very chummy with Lady Danbury recently. She's been reading to Lady Danbury in the evenings on like Tuesdays or something like that, and she's basically built up this friendship with Lady Danbury, and now she is put in proximity with Gareth because he's returned to town or something like that. Now, this initial setup seemed pretty good, and I liked the characters' initial banter, and I felt like Gareth was gonna have a little bit more depth to him than Michael did in the previous book. But honestly, I feel like this book didn't do much better than When He Was Wicked. The one thing that this book had going for it over When He Was Wicked is that it had this whole mystery plot. So essentially Gareth stumbles upon this old journal of his other grandmother, who happens to be part Italian or is Italian, and his father has never really talked about his Italian heritage. And that grandmother was Isabella, I think, and she was very fond of Gareth and Gareth was fond of her. And so when he gets his hands on this diary that's written completely in Italian, he decides to take it to Lady Danbury. And of course, when he shows up at her house, Hyacinth happens to be there. And so he just essentially reveals to both of them that he has his diary and he needs to figure out a way to read it. Because he's pretty sure that somewhere in that diary, there is some hint of his true parentage and also potentially some sort of other fortune. And this is where Hyacinth's fluency in Italian comes in handy. She had a governess or something who was Italian, something like that. And so she knows Italian, but she's not like super great at it. And so she needs some time to go through the diary and translate it part by part. And the book sort of takes us from there, and we follow them both as they are translating this diary and finding out more details. And then while that's happening, Violet Bridgerton and Lady Danbury are also sort of plotting to get Gareth and Hyacinth together, because it turns out that Hyacinth hasn't been able to get a husband. She's been on the market for a few seasons, and every season she starts to get less and less proposals. And so everyone's starting to get concerned, and it seems like it's because of how outspoken Hyacinth is and how she always has an opinion. So up until this point, I was still doing pretty good. The banter between the characters was nice, and when they're trying to figure out this mystery, it was fun to follow them. But then from there, somehow the romance just gets forced into the story. And what I didn't end up liking about this book was that Gareth ended up being very similar to Michael in the previous book, because he also had this notion of just sort of aggressively forcing the relationship onto Hyacinth. Essentially, he has this moment where his father tells him that, you know, he'll never be able to get Hyacinth, he'll never be able to marry her, she's way above him, him. He's just an illegitimate bastard. He won't be able to get her. And so immediately after that scene, he sees Hyacinth and decides to kiss her. And then it's like this weird situation where she's not really experienced and he says, you know, you're not kissing properly. And then she leaves and gets all flustered and upset. And then when they meet again, she's just sort of being chill and wants to continue with this mystery. But he has decided that he wants to marry her now because of this whole complex with his father. He goes and gets Antony's permission, and Antony's like, this is fine, but you have to go ask her yourself. I'm not going to tell her that you asked me for her hand. You need to get her to say yes. And so from there, Gareth actually does ask her to marry him, but he doesn't really do like the big grand love declaration, and she's also confused as to why he asked her to marry him. But at this point, she's sort of fallen for him already, which again, I felt like the chemistry and the relationship just went too fast and it didn't really make much sense. Yes, they had good banter and yes, they were friends, but I didn't see it going past that. I didn't really see the chemistry between them. And then it just got worse in my opinion, because after that, Gareth is essentially like, oh, he needs to trap Hyacinth into this relationship and make sure that even if she finds out that he's illegitimate, or when he tells her eventually, that she won't be able to leave him, that she'll still be forced to marry him. And so he wants to force a quicker marriage and a shorter engagement. And so he decides that the best way to do that is to compromise her and her honor. He essentially engineers this whole situation where he tells her that they're going to go search for these jewels that were mentioned in the diary, and they're supposed to meet at midnight at her house and then head to the Baron's house and go look for them. But instead, he sort of engineers the situation so that they end up becoming intimate and having sex instead of going to find these jewels. And it all happened according to his plan. And he's sort of pushing the sex, I feel like, in that scene. And she doesn't necessarily start really agreeing until later in the scene. There's even this moment in the scene where she was initially aroused and then she gets kind of scared, and then he's trying to get her back into the mood. And it was just so weird to me, honestly, and I just didn't like this idea of him trying to compromise her. It just felt so sleazy and aggressive and not really romantic in any way. And of course, at some point later, Hyacinth finds out that he kind of asked her to marry him because he was sort of goaded by his father, and that bothers her, but she's still like, you know, we're getting married, like there's no backing out. And she's still neck deep into this situation and very happy to go along with it. Which again, I was just like, why? And honestly, I just felt like Hyacinth herself just felt really childish in a way. She was just so naive in some senses. She's definitely on the younger side. She's, I think, 22. But despite being out for multiple seasons, I still didn't feel like she was that mature. And she, for the most part, just took everything he said and didn't really question him. When he tells her eventually that he's illegitimate, she's totally fine with it, which was fine. And then the book sort of comes to a close when Hyacinth finds out his true parentage from the diary, and the story sort of wraps up with a nice bow. I feel like this book was just not it, and the more I think about it and the more I talk about it, I feel like I like this even less than When He Was Wicked, but I did appreciate the mystery element. So honestly, they're kind of both on the same level for me, because this one I didn't really like the chemistry between the characters, whereas in When He Was Wicked I did see it a little bit, even though I still didn't really like Michael, and again, I didn't really like Gareth in this one. And although I like the mystery in this one, I didn't really like the steamy, sexy scenes in this one all that much. I feel like the ones in When He Was Wicked were a lot better, much more steamy, and much more well built up, I feel like. So yeah, if I had to rate this one, I think it would be like a 3, maybe even a 2.5, because honestly, I wasn't really feeling this one. I don't feel like I got too much out of the story, and I feel like these last few books are just starting to blur together for me because none of them feel super significant. In terms of theories for season 3, this book is interesting because we do find out that Gareth is Lady Danbury's grandson. So there's a potential that we might get his character introduced earlier in the series, but there's also a potential that we might get him introduced later. But this whole like 10 years prior situation could happen in the next season or 2. One thing about this book that also got me thinking was the fact that Hyacinth and Gregory are so much younger than the other siblings in the book. And so I'm wondering at what point they're gonna do the time jump to make these two characters older. Because on the one hand, they could do it right before Hyacinth and Gregory's seasons, but based off the way the show's already going and the way that Penelope's story isn't taking place like many years later the way it does in the books, it's been moved up several years so that it's like only 1 year later after the second season. So the question kind of remains, where is the time jump gonna happen? Is it gonna happen during Benedict's season? Is it gonna happen during Eloise's season? Is it gonna happen mid-season in season 3? Who knows? I feel like a mid-season jump would be kind of fun and interesting, but I feel like if it was actually happening, we would have heard some rumblings about the new castings for some of these characters. So who knows? With that said, I'm kind of happy that I didn't read these when I did the initial video because I really enjoyed those first few books, and I feel like if I had read these right after, I would have been continuously disappointed. From book 4 onwards, I just wasn't enjoying things as much. I still think that the first 3 books really stand out as much better in my opinion, but we'll see what I think of the final book in the series, Gregory's story, On the Way to the Wedding. Okay, we're finally here. I've finished reading On the Way to the Wedding, Gregory's Story, the final Bridgerton book. I have to say, after reading the other 2 books, this one definitely impressed me the most because it actually had some plot to it. I mentioned this in my previous Bridgerton video, but in all of the books, I felt like the romances were a little bit too easy and that there wasn't much conflict towards the end, aside from stupid misunderstandings. And the only one that stood out to me in the first 5 was the 3rd book, Benedict's Story, because it actually had a lot more plot that carries you through to the end of the book. There's a little bit of mystery and other stuff going on, and most of the stuff that's keeping the characters apart is stuff larger than themselves. And so that's one of the major reasons why I love the 3rd book. It's a Cinderella story, so it's just so fun. And I have to say, On the Way to the Wedding gave me a similar vibe. Obviously, it's not like a retelling or anything like that, but it does start with this really dramatic scene where Gregory is like running to this wedding and he sees the girl he loves about to get married, and he's trying to stop the wedding and he proposes to her on the spot. But at the beginning of the book, we don't know who she is, we don't know anything about her, and we don't know how he's gotten to this position. And so the book flashes back to the actual beginning of the story, and we meet these 2 women, Lucinda, Lady Lucinda, who is known as Lucy, and then we also have Hermione, her best friend. Hermione happens to be this really beautiful girl, and everyone always falls in love with her, and Lucy is always like on the side, but she really loves Hermione as her friend, and they have a really strong bond. And so of course, Gregory, the hopeless romantic that he is, given that all of his siblings have married for love, he finds himself instantly falling in love with Hermione the second he sees her, which was just funny and kind of cute, but also like you can tell how dumb he is. But little does he know that Hermione's actually in love with her father's secretary. And Lucy's really against this because she knows that would never work out, and she's trying to convince Hermione out of this, love that she thinks she has for this secretary that she's like barely interacted with. And she really just wants her to find someone better and like more of her class and that kind of thing, something that would actually work and something that's practical. And Lucy overall is that very, very practical character throughout the book. She's lost her parents, and she and her brother were brought up by their uncle, who's not the nicest guy. And from a young age, she's also been betrothed to this one guy named Hazelby, who's like the son of a count or something like that. And so she's sort of known the trajectory of her life. And so when Gregory falls all over himself in love with Hermione, Lucy thinks that he might actually be a good match for Hermione. So she starts to help him sort of try to get Hermione, which is my favorite type of trope, the Cyrano trope, where the main character or the love interest tries to help the other one, be with someone else. So from there, Lucy and Gregory interact a lot, and I liked seeing their like banter and just like them together. They were fun to follow, and it was really nice that they sort of grow from friends into more. One fun thing about this book is that we actually get a lot of Kate, Antony's wife, in this book, so I'm trying to imagine how this might work in the adaptation. But she's doing a lot of hosting, which comes into play for the plot, and she also does a masquerade ball, which leads to some very interesting plot points in this book, which I absolutely loved. And actually, I don't want to spoil this one too much for you guys because I feel like you could actually really enjoy it and fall in love with some of the twists and turns. But I think what I really liked about this one was that, like Benedict's story, it took the characters through to almost the end before they actually like get together. They do confess their feelings a little bit earlier, but not as early as all of the other books where they're saying I love you by a third into the book and you're like, how? You've barely talked to each other. This one also definitely has way less spice than the other books, I would say, like in comparison to all of the other books. There was maybe one major scene, and even that wasn't super explicit or involved. And so in some ways, this book did feel a little bit more platonic and cute rather than like sexy and steamy, but I did find it so much more believable as a romance and as a progression of the story. Another thing I have to say is that I just liked Gregory more than Michael or Gareth because both of those guys just got on my nerves in the way that they use sex as a manipulative tool, whereas Gregory does not do that, even though he has his like fragile masculinity traits where he's like, oh, I'm gonna save you and whatever else. He's still a lot better than Michael and Gareth. And I think this is something that I've sort of noticed across the books. The books where we are following a male Bridgerton, the male characters are obviously nice and good people because they are our main characters and they need to be good people. Whereas the books where we have a female Bridgerton as the main character, the love interest male character is always a bit of a douche. I feel like Simon was the one exception, but Eloise's guy, Sir Philip, Michael for Francesca, and then Gareth for Hyacinth all did not work for me. Whereas the male Bridgertons in each of their books, I like them a lot, aside from maybe Colin, but they were much better love interests, in my opinion, than the external love interests we get. I don't know if that was intentional or if she just like subconsciously wrote the characters that way, but that's how it felt. I also feel like a common thread across all these books is just the lack of agency for our female characters and how they're often treated in like these weird and stupid ways. Like they're lied to by their love interests, they are coerced by their love interests, they're emotionally pulled and tossed around by their love interests, and overall it just made me mad, I think. So yeah, 2 years out from the previous Bridgerton video that I did, I feel like I don't love these books as much as I originally did. Even now, looking back on some of the first 5 books, I would probably give them lower ratings now, given that I've read better romances since then. So even though I enjoyed On the Way to the Wedding more than the other 2 in this video, and even though I felt the romance was more believable, I still wouldn't say that this one's like a 5 or even 4 stars. It's probably still like a 3 or 3.5. But in comparison to the other books, I feel like my ranking would probably go Benedict's story, Antony's story, Gregory's, and then maybe Daphne's. But then all the other ones I feel like are just in a similar vein for me because I just didn't like them as much. So Penelope's, Eloise's, Francesca's, and Hyacinth's, all of them had some shady bits to them, and I just didn't really like how little agency the female main characters had, except for maybe Penelope. And I just wanted more out of the love interests in those books because they just weren't it. So having read this final book and now knowing the full Bridgerton series sort of scope, I am really interested to see how they're going to handle season 3. As I said before, I think there might be a time jump mid-season. It would make a lot of sense and also just breed some really great excitement for the audience and would also get us closer to the later stories in the series. However, I don't know exactly how and when they would do that in Colin and Penelope's story based off of what we know from the book. I'm kind of vague on the details for that one, so I can't remember exactly where we might do a time jump because obviously the time jump happens before the book starts for that one. And I'm also really interested to see how they're going to deal with the Lady Whistledown situation in the show. Because one thing I was thinking about as I was reading was that all the books that come after Penelope's do not have Lady Whistledown in any capacity. The earlier books all have like these passages at the beginning of the chapters where we get Lady Whistledown's gossip, and her gossip also plays like a pivotal plot point and role in each of the stories. And in book 5, in Penelope's book, it's revealed that she's Lady Whistledown and everyone else also learns that she's Lady Whistledown. So I'm curious to see how the show is going to deal with that because obviously we already know as an audience that she's Lady Whistledown, but the rest of the ton doesn't know that she's Lady Whistledown. And so will they actually reveal that in season 3 as part of her story? I think it would make sense because that's part of her character growth, but it would also hinder using Lady Whistledown in future seasons, which I think would detract from the drama that we get in the show, which I think a lot of people really, really like. Another element to this is that Benedict's story in particular really does depend on the Lady Whistledown plot points and her revealing gossip. So I think it would be really hard to write out the Lady Whistledown parts of that book and adapt it in a different way. So I feel like in some capacity in season 3, they are still going to preserve Lady Whistledown so Penelope can still be her and still report as her throughout the rest of the series, because I think if there isn't a Lady Whistledown, then it's not going to be as compelling. And this is also a reason why I think it's so interesting that they pushed up Penelope's story in the series rather than waiting for like season 5, or actually 4. I think it's book 4. With that said, for season 4, I think it's probably going to be either Francesca's story, Eloise's, or Benedict's, but I feel like the showrunners for some reason really want to push off Benedict's for some odd reason, and I can't tell why. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen there. Another aspect to this is like, when is the time jump going to happen? When are we going to get Hyacinth and Gregory as older characters that, you know, we'd actually want to see fall in love? Because right now they're like tiny and you cannot imagine them like falling in love and getting up to the nasty and that kind of thing. So I'm just intrigued to see how that's going to go. Anyways, those are all of my jumbled and chaotic thoughts about the Bridgerton series, about the books, about the show, about what I'm expecting for season 3. Let me know if you've read the Bridgerton books and what you thought of them. What did you think of the last 3 books? What did you think of the first 5? If you didn't see my previous video, go check that out and go leave your comments there or here and let's discuss all of the books. And on the flip side, if you are only a fan of the show, then let me know down below what you thought of my thoughts on these last 3 books and, you know, my overall ranking of the books and what you're expecting for season 3 and beyond. I absolutely love discussing anything Bridgerton related, so please do not leave me hanging and comment down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you would like me to do a full season 3 review at all, let me know down below. That may be something on the horizon if I feel like I have significant thoughts about season 3. So let me know down below. As always, if you haven't already, go check out my Instagram, Goodreads, TikTok, and bindery community down below. If you didn't know, my bindery community is kind of like Patreon plus publishing. You can help support me and my channel, and you can also help me publish books with my imprint, Boundless Press. We are very close to offering on a book very, very soon, so if you want to be part of the behind the scenes process, then definitely join down below and go watch the whole bank of videos that I have made on the submissions process. With that said, I'll see you guys in my next video, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!